I'm Eleanor, and I collect the forgotten messages that change lives long after they were written, handwritten secrets tucked away in the most unexpected places, waiting decades to reveal truths that could have changed everything. 3 weeks ago, I received a package from Charlotte Thompson in Columbus, Ohio. Inside was a yellowed piece of paper, no bigger than a business card, along with a story so heartbreaking and beautiful that it took me days to fully process what I was reading. This tiny message had been hidden in the hem of a wedding dress for 40 years. Charlotte discovered it while cleaning out her attic after her husband's sudden death from cardiac arrest. What she found wasn't just a piece of paper, it was evidence that her entire married life had been built on a lie she had created to protect herself from the cruelest rejection she'd ever experienced. The message was from James, the man who had broken her heart 6 months before her wedding by telling her he could never love someone like her. But the words on that hidden paper told a completely different story, a desperate confession of love and regret from a man who realized too late that he had destroyed his only chance at true happiness. This discovery would force Charlotte to confront 40 years of guilt, wondering if she had wasted her life loving the wrong man while the right one spent 4 decades believing she was better off without him. Have you ever discovered that someone who hurt you deeply was actually protecting you from an even greater pain? Share your experience in the comments, because Charlotte's story will show you how sometimes the cruelest words hide the most desperate love. Charlotte Wilson was 28 years old in the autumn of 1983, working as the head librarian at the Worthington Public Library in suburban Columbus. She had always been what people politely called full-figured, carrying extra weight since adolescence in a decade that worshipped thin supermodels and aerobic instructors. The cruel comments from classmates in high school had carved deep wounds in her self-esteem, but Charlotte had learned to armor herself with intelligence and kindness, becoming the person everyone turned to for help but few considered for romance. The Worthington Library was Charlotte's sanctuary, a beautiful Carnegie building with soaring ceilings and tall windows that filled the reading rooms with golden afternoon light. She knew every book on every shelf, could recommend the perfect novel for any mood, and had created reading programs that brought the whole community together. Her colleagues respected her, the regular patrons adored her, and Charlotte had convinced herself that a fulfilling career might be enough to fill the spaces in her life that longed for deeper connection. Everything changed in March 1983 when James Crawford walked through the library's oak doors carrying a briefcase full of engineering blueprints and asking for access to the historical archives. He was 31, tall and lean with dark hair that always looked slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it while working on complicated problems. He was in town for 6 months, overseeing the renovation of the historic Griggs Dam, and he needed access to original construction documents dating back to 1905. Charlotte helped him navigate the archives, and what should have been a simple research request turned into hours of conversation about history, architecture, and the way old buildings seemed to hold the dreams of everyone who had built them. James had studied engineering at Ohio State before moving to Chicago for work, but he talked about buildings the way poets talked about love, with reverence for the hands that had shaped them and wonder at the lives they had sheltered. "You really love this place," James said one afternoon, looking around the reading room where Charlotte had spent thousands of hours. "I can see it in the way you move through here, like you're tending a garden." "Books are living things," Charlotte replied, feeling brave enough to share something she rarely voiced. "Every time someone opens one, they're having a conversation with everyone who ever read those same words. This building is full of invisible conversations happening across time." James looked at her with something Charlotte had never seen directed at her before, genuine admiration mixed with attraction. "That's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever said about a library." Their friendship deepened throughout the spring and early summer of 1983. James would arrive each morning with coffee for both of them, and they would spend lunch breaks walking through the tree-lined streets of Worthington, talking about everything and nothing. Charlotte learned that James had grown up in a wealthy family in Shaker Heights, that his father expected him to take over the family's construction business, and that he felt trapped between duty and the desire to build something meaningful with his engineering degree. James learned that Charlotte read 3 books a week, that she had never traveled outside Ohio but could describe Paris better than most people who'd lived there, and that behind her shy exterior was a woman with opinions about everything from city planning to social justice to the best way to make apple pie. By July, Charlotte realized she was completely in love. James seemed to enjoy her company, sought her out every day, and treated her with a gentleness she'd never experienced from any man. When he brushed her hand while reaching for a book, when he listened to her ideas about improving the library's community programs, when he laughed at her jokes with genuine delight, Charlotte began to believe that maybe, possibly, someone could see past her physical imperfections and love her for who she really was. The night before James was scheduled to return to Chicago, Charlotte worked up the courage to tell him how she felt. They were sitting on the library steps as the sun set behind the old oak trees, and Charlotte's heart was pounding so hard she was sure James could hear it. "James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something before you leave." "I need to tell you something too," James replied, but his voice carried a weight that made Charlotte's stomach drop. "Charlotte, you're an amazing person. You're kind and smart, and you've made these 6 months the best time I've had in years." Charlotte felt hope rising in her chest, but James's expression was growing more distant with each word. "But I have to be honest with you," James continued, standing up and putting space between them. "You're a wonderful friend, but I could never love someone like you. I mean, romantically. You deserve better than someone who needs you to take better care of yourself before we could ever be more than friends." The words hit Charlotte like physical blows. Someone like you. Take better care of yourself. Every insecurity she'd ever carried was confirmed in that moment by the man she'd trusted with her heart. "I see," Charlotte managed, standing on shaking legs. "Thank you for being honest." James looked like he wanted to say more, but Charlotte was already walking toward her car, desperate to escape before the tears started. She heard him call her name, but she didn't turn around. She drove home in a blur of humiliation and grief, and by the time she reached her small apartment, she was sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. Charlotte spent the next 3 months in a depression deeper than any she'd ever experienced. She went to work, performed her duties at the library, and came home to cry herself to sleep. Food, which had always been both comfort and enemy, became her only companion during the long evenings when James's words echoed in her mind, "I could never love someone like you." The worst part wasn't just the rejection, it was that Charlotte had genuinely believed James cared for her. She replayed every conversation, every shared laugh, every moment when she thought she saw affection in his eyes. Had she imagined it all? Had her desperate desire for love made her misread simple kindness as romantic interest? By October, Charlotte's concerned colleagues were suggesting she talk to someone about her obvious unhappiness. Her supervisor, Mrs. Henderson, even offered to help her find a counselor, but Charlotte was too ashamed to admit that she was falling apart over a man who had never even kissed her. It was in November that Charlotte met Robert Thompson. He was a substitute teacher filling in for the elementary school librarian who was on maternity leave, and he came to the public library seeking resources for his 3rd grade class. Robert was 42, recently widowed, with 2 daughters aged 8 and 10. He was soft-spoken, patient, and when he smiled at Charlotte, there was no judgment in his eyes, only genuine warmth. Robert had lost his wife to breast cancer 2 years earlier and was still navigating the challenges of single parenthood while trying to process his own grief. He wasn't looking for romance, just someone who understood books and could recommend stories that might help his daughters work through their loss. Charlotte found herself looking forward to Robert's visits. He treated her with respect and appreciation, valued her expertise, and never made her feel like she had to be anyone other than who she was. When he asked if she'd like to have coffee sometime, not as a date but as a friend who understood the weight of loneliness, Charlotte said yes. Their friendship developed slowly through the winter months. Robert's daughters, Emma and Sarah, were shy but sweet, and they responded well to Charlotte's gentle manner and seemingly endless knowledge of children's literature. Charlotte found herself caring deeply about this small, wounded family, and when Robert told her in March that he was falling in love with her, she felt a mixture of gratitude and guilt. "I know it might seem fast," Robert said as they sat in her living room after putting the girls to bed following a dinner that felt remarkably like family. "But you've brought light back into our lives, Charlotte. Emma and Sarah adore you, and I love you. Not because I need someone to help with the girls, but because you're kind and intelligent and beautiful, and I can't imagine my life without you anymore." Charlotte looked at this good man who saw beauty in her when she couldn't see it in herself, who loved her without conditions or expectations of change, and she felt her broken heart begin to heal. It wasn't the passionate, desperate love she'd felt for James, but it was steady and real and safe. "I love you too," Charlotte said, meaning it even as part of her heart remained locked away behind James's cruel words. Robert proposed in June, and Charlotte said yes. They planned a December wedding, small and simple, with just family and close friends. Charlotte chose a traditional white dress from a local bridal shop, nothing elaborate, but beautiful in its simplicity. The seamstress, Mrs. O'Brien, was an Irish woman in her 70s who had been altering wedding dresses for 50 years. "Such a lovely dress for a lovely bride," Mrs. O'Brien said during the final fitting. "And look here, someone has left you a little surprise." She held up a small piece of paper that had fallen from the dress's hem. "Must have been tucked in there at the shop. Probably a note from one of the girls who made the dress, wishing you luck." Charlotte glanced at the paper but didn't read it. She was focused on how the dress fit, on whether the alterations were perfect, on all the details that seemed so important before a wedding. Mrs. O'Brien tucked the paper back into the dress's layers, and Charlotte forgot about it completely. "Now I need to ask you something that Charlotte wrestled with for years. When you've been deeply hurt by someone, how do you open your heart to love someone else? Is it fair to marry someone when part of you is still healing from someone else's rejection?" Charlotte struggled with these questions throughout her engagement, wondering if she was being fair to Robert by accepting his love when she couldn't give him the same passionate devotion he offered her. Charlotte married Robert Thompson on a snowy December day in 1984, in the small Methodist church where she had attended services since childhood. The ceremony was simple but beautiful: white roses and candles, traditional vows spoken with sincerity if not overwhelming passion, and two little girls in red velvet dresses who finally had the mother they'd been praying for. Charlotte wore her altered wedding dress and smiled for the photographs, but anyone who looked closely might have noticed that her happiness seemed effortful, as if she was working to feel the joy everyone expected from a bride. Robert, by contrast, was radiant with contentment, holding Charlotte's hand as if he couldn't quite believe his luck in finding love a second time. The early years of their marriage were marked by the pleasant rhythms of family life. Charlotte became Emma and Sarah's stepmother with dedication and genuine affection, helping them with homework, attending school plays, and creating the kind of stable home environment that helped them heal from losing their biological mother. In 1987, Charlotte gave birth to Michael, and 2 years later, to Jessica. Robert was a devoted father and husband, and their household buzzed with the comfortable chaos of raising 4 children. But Charlotte carried a secret weight that she never shared with anyone, not even Robert. She loved her family deeply, but she was haunted by the constant awareness that she had married Robert more from gratitude and fear of being alone than from passionate love. She tried to convince herself that mature love was supposed to be different from youthful infatuation, that stability and mutual respect were more valuable than the intense connection she'd felt with James. The guilt was worst during intimate moments, when Robert would tell her how much he loved her, how grateful he was to have found her, how beautiful she was to him. Charlotte would respond appropriately, but inside, she felt like a fraud. How could she accept such devotion when her heart was still partially frozen by another man's rejection? Over the years, Charlotte occasionally found herself searching for news about James. In the pre-internet era, this meant scanning engineering journals at the university library or asking casual questions of colleagues who traveled to Chicago. She learned that James had indeed taken over his family's construction company, that he had built it into one of the most successful firms in the Midwest, and that he had never married. This last piece of information always left her with a mixture of vindication and sadness. Vindication that maybe she hadn't been completely wrong about their connection, sadness that James seemed to have closed himself off from love entirely. Robert never questioned Charlotte's occasional distraction or the way she sometimes seemed to be mentally somewhere else during family gatherings. He attributed it to the natural stresses of raising 4 children and managing a household, and he responded by being even more supportive and understanding. His kindness only made Charlotte's guilt worse. The children thrived under their parents' care. Emma and Sarah grew into confident young women who always spoke of Charlotte as their real mother, the one who had raised them and loved them through all the important moments of their lives. Michael became an excellent student with his father's gentle nature, and Jessica inherited Charlotte's love of books and reading. To outside observers, the Thompsons were a model family, stable, loving, successful. Charlotte threw herself into community involvement as a way of channeling her restless energy and persistent guilt. She expanded the library's programs, served on school committees, and volunteered for local charities. Robert supported all her endeavors, proud of his wife's contributions to their community and never complaining about the long hours she spent on projects that seemed to fulfill something in her that family life alone couldn't satisfy. The years passed in this pattern: outward success and inward struggle, genuine love mixed with persistent regret. Charlotte celebrated her children's achievements, supported Robert's career advancement to principal and then school superintendent, and built a reputation as one of the most respected women in Worthington. But late at night, when the house was quiet and Robert was sleeping peacefully beside her, Charlotte sometimes found herself wondering about the life she might have had if James had been brave enough to love her as she was. I want to pause here to thank those of you who follow these stories and share your own experiences with complicated family dynamics. Charlotte's struggle with loving someone while carrying the wounds from someone else is something many people understand, even if they've never talked about it openly. Your comments help others feel less alone in their own complicated relationships. Robert Thompson died on a Tuesday morning in March 2024, at the age of 82. He had been working in their garden, preparing the soil for Charlotte's annual vegetable garden, when he suffered a massive cardiac arrest. Charlotte found him when she came outside with his morning coffee, and despite the paramedics' best efforts, he was gone within minutes of their arrival. The funeral was a testament to the kind of man Robert had been. The church was packed with former students, teaching colleagues, and community members whose lives he had touched over 4 decades in education. Charlotte, now 69, sat in the front pew surrounded by their children and grandchildren, accepting condolences from hundreds of people who spoke of Robert's kindness, wisdom, and devotion to his family. "Your father was the best man I ever knew," Charlotte told her children at the reception after the burial. "He loved all of us completely and without condition. I hope you remember that about him always." It was true. Robert had been a genuinely good man who had given Charlotte and the children 40 years of stability, support, and unconditional love. Charlotte's grief was real and deep, complicated by guilt over the parts of her heart she had never been able to give him fully. The weeks following Robert's death were filled with the practical necessities of widowhood, managing finances, dealing with insurance companies, making decisions about the house that had been their family home for nearly 4 decades. The children, all adults now with families of their own, rallied around Charlotte with love and support, but they also had their own lives to return to after the immediate crisis passed. By late summer, Charlotte realized she needed to make some major decisions about her future. The 4-bedroom house felt enormous and empty without Robert's presence, and maintaining it was becoming both physically and financially challenging. Michael and Jessica both suggested she consider moving to a smaller place, perhaps a senior living community where she could maintain her independence while having access to support and social activities. Charlotte decided to downsize to a 2-bedroom condominium in a well-managed complex near the library where she had spent her career. The decision meant sorting through 40 years of accumulated possessions, a daunting task that she approached methodically, room by room, making piles for keeping, donating, and discarding. The attic was the last and most emotionally challenging space to clear. It contained boxes of Christmas decorations, children's artwork from elementary school, old photo albums, and the kinds of sentimental items that accumulate over decades of family life. Charlotte had been avoiding it, but with the movers scheduled to arrive in 2 weeks, she finally climbed the folding stairs on a crisp October afternoon. Among the stored items was a cedar chest that had belonged to Charlotte's grandmother, filled with linens and special occasion items that rarely saw use. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, was Charlotte's wedding dress. She hadn't looked at it in decades, but she remembered her grandmother telling her that every bride should save her dress as a reminder of the promises she made on her wedding day. Charlotte lifted the dress carefully, surprised by how delicate the fabric had become after 40 years of storage. As she unfolded it to examine its condition, a small piece of paper fluttered to the attic floor. For a moment, Charlotte thought it might be a receipt or care instruction that had been forgotten in the dress, but as she picked it up, she recognized the handwriting that had once been as familiar to her as her own. The paper was no larger than a bookmark, and the ink had faded to a soft brown, but the words were still legible. "Charlotte, I made the biggest mistake of my life tonight. I love you more than I have words to express, but my cowardice and my family's expectations made me hurt you instead of fighting for what we could have together. If you're reading this, it means you married Robert, and I hope he makes you happier than I was brave enough to try. But know that you have always been and will always be the love of my life. Please forgive me. Forever yours, James." Charlotte read the message 3 times before the words fully registered. James had loved her. James had loved her enough to sneak this message into her wedding dress, knowing she might not find it for years, if ever. The man who had rejected her so cruelly had been lying not just to her, but to himself. Charlotte sat on the attic floor, holding the dress and the message, crying for the first time since Robert's funeral. But these weren't tears of grief, they were tears of recognition, understanding, and a strange kind of relief. She hadn't been delusional about James's feelings. She hadn't imagined the connection between them. James had loved her as much as she had loved him, but something had made him believe that love wasn't enough. The discovery of James's message left Charlotte in an emotional state she hadn't experienced since she was 28 years old. After the initial shock wore off, she found herself analyzing every memory from that summer in 1983, seeing James's behavior through the new lens of understanding that he had been fighting his own feelings even as he was falling in love with her. His sudden coldness, the way he had put physical distance between them when he rejected her, the fact that he had called her name as she walked away, all of it made sense now if he had been trying to convince himself as much as her that their relationship was impossible. Charlotte spent weeks debating whether to try to find James. She was 69 years old, recently widowed, facing the prospect of spending her remaining years alone. James would be 71 now, if he was still alive. Was it fair to either of them to resurrect feelings that had been buried for 40 years? But Charlotte couldn't stop thinking about the words "forever yours" written in James's careful handwriting. If he had been telling the truth in that hidden message, then he had spent 4 decades believing she had chosen Robert over him, never knowing that she had never seen his confession of love. Using internet searches that would have been impossible in 1983, Charlotte easily found current information about James Crawford. He was indeed still alive, recently retired from Crawford Construction, living in a townhouse in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood. His company's website included a biography mentioning his numerous civic contributions and professional achievements, but no mention of a wife or family. A Google image search showed recent photos from charity events: James at 71, his dark hair now silver, lines around his eyes, but still recognizably the man who had broken her heart and then apparently broken his own. Charlotte crafted and discarded dozens of letters before settling on a simple, direct approach. "Dear James, I recently found something you left for me 40 years ago, hidden in my wedding dress. I never saw your message until now. If you would be willing to have a conversation about what happened between us in 1983, I would very much like to understand. With hope for your understanding, Charlotte Wilson Thompson." James's response came within a week, in an email that showed he had looked her up as thoroughly as she had researched him. "Charlotte, I have thought about you every day for 40 years. I have wanted to contact you 1,000 times but never felt I had the right after what I did to you. Yes, I would very much like to talk. When would be convenient for you?" They arranged to meet at a coffee shop in downtown Columbus, neutral territory where they could talk without the pressure of either person's home environment. Charlotte arrived first, choosing a corner table where they could have privacy, her heart pounding with the same nervous energy she remembered from their first conversations at the library. James walked through the door exactly on time, and Charlotte felt her breath catch. He was older, obviously, with lines that spoke of decades of worry and work, but his eyes were the same warm brown she remembered, and when he saw her, his face lit up with genuine joy. "Charlotte," he said, sitting across from her with the same careful attention to her comfort that had characterized their relationship 40 years earlier. "You look wonderful. I mean that sincerely." "Thank you," Charlotte replied, feeling suddenly shy. "You look well too, James. Successful. I followed your company's work over the years. You built something impressive." "I built what my father expected me to build," James said with a rueful smile. "But we're not here to talk about business success, are we?" You found my message." 40 years later, Charlotte confirmed. "James, why did you lie to me that night? Why did you hurt me like that when you apparently felt something completely different?" James was quiet for a long moment, staring at his coffee cup. When he looked up, Charlotte could see the weight of decades in his expression. "My parents," he said simply. "My father specifically, but my mother supported him. They had seen us together that summer. Apparently someone from Worthington knew someone in Shaker Heights, and word got back to them about their son spending time with a woman who didn't meet their standards." Charlotte felt the familiar sting of that old pain. Their standards. "Charlotte, please understand their standards were wrong, cruel, and based on superficial judgments that had nothing to do with who you actually were as a person. But I was 31 years old, still financially dependent on my father, and terrified of being cut off from everything I had ever known. When they threatened to disinherit me if I brought you home, I panicked." James's voice broke slightly. "I thought if I hurt you badly enough, you would move on and find someone better than a coward who would let his parents control his life. I thought you would be happier without me, and I thought I could learn to live with losing you. I was wrong on both counts." "You never married," Charlotte said. "It wasn't a question." "How could I?" James replied. "I spent 40 years comparing every woman I met to you, and none of them even came close. I convinced myself that I had given up my one chance at real love because I wasn't brave enough to fight for it when it mattered." Charlotte reached across the table and took James's hand. "I loved Robert," she said quietly. "He was a good man, and he gave me 40 years of stability and kindness. But James, I never stopped wondering what would have happened if you had trusted me enough to tell me the truth. Can you forgive me?" James asked, his thumb tracing circles on Charlotte's palm. "I forgave you 40 years ago," Charlotte replied. "I just didn't know there was anything to forgive except bad judgment. Now I know it was fear, and I understand fear." They talked for 3 hours that first day, filling in 40 years of separate lives, sharing photos of Charlotte's children and grandchildren, James's business achievements, the paths their lives had taken away from each other. When they parted, they made plans to meet again the following week. Over the next several months, Charlotte and James rebuilt their friendship and slowly acknowledged that the feelings between them had never really died. Charlotte was honest about her grief over Robert's death and her need to move slowly. James was patient, content to rediscover the woman he had never stopped loving and to prove that at 71, he was finally brave enough to choose love over fear. On a snowy December day in 2024, exactly 40 years after Charlotte's first wedding, James asked her to marry him again, not to replace what she had built with Robert, but to finally claim the love they had both been denied by fear and social pressure. Charlotte said yes, holding the faded message that had brought them back together after 4 decades of separation. Sometimes, she realized, love requires patience measured in decades, forgiveness that spans generations, and the wisdom to understand that the right love can survive almost anything, even our own mistakes. Charlotte Thompson became Charlotte Crawford in a small ceremony attended by her children and grandchildren, who were amazed by their mother's unexpected second chance at the kind of love most people only read about in novels. James had gained not just a wife, but a ready-made family who welcomed him with the same grace Charlotte had shown Robert's daughters 40 years earlier. As Charlotte told me when she sent that precious message, some stories take a lifetime to reach their proper ending. I spent 40 years thinking I had settled for safety over passion, never knowing that the man I thought had rejected me was actually protecting me from his own weaknesses. Finding that message didn't just change my understanding of the past, it gave me permission to believe in love again at an age when most people think such possibilities are behind them. James and Charlotte now split their time between Chicago and Columbus, visiting grandchildren and great-grandchildren, traveling to places Charlotte always dreamed of seeing, and proving that it's never too late for love to triumph over fear, family expectations, and the wounds we carry from our younger selves. What would you have done in Charlotte's situation? Would you have contacted James after finding his message, or would you have let sleeping dogs lie? And what about James? Do you understand his decision to lie about his feelings to protect Charlotte from his family's judgment? Or do you think he should have been braver 40 years earlier? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This story reminds us that sometimes the most important messages in our lives are hidden in the most unexpected places, waiting decades to be discovered when we're finally ready to understand their true meaning. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more discoveries that prove love can survive almost anything, including time, misunderstanding, and our own mistakes. Your support helps me continue sharing these profound human stories that remind us we're never too old for second chances. I'm Eleanor, and I collect the forgotten messages that change lives long after they were written. Charlotte's hidden message reminds us that some love stories are worth waiting 40 years to finish, and that the truth has a way of surfacing exactly when we need it most. Until next time, remember that the most important words in your life might be hidden in the most unexpected places, waiting for the perfect moment to change everything you thought you knew about your own story.